Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's ESTO webinar, Funding Futures. I'd also like to give a thank you to U.S. Travels Destinations Council for being a partner in this study. We have an amazing lineup of speakers and panelists today, so we're just going to go ahead and jump right in. Joining us today, we have John Lambeth with Civitas. We have Adam Sachs with Tourism Economics. We have Chris Adams with Miles Partnership. And we also have Aaron Francis Cummings with Destination Analyst. These industry thought leaders need nothing more than this introduction. You all know who they are. I don't need to read their bio. And joining us today on the panel are two DMO luminaries. We have Al Hutchinson, CEO and President of Baltimore, and Kathy Ritter, Director of Colorado Tourism. So Chris, I'm turning it over to you. Let's go.
Okay, thanks so much, Nan, and good afternoon, good morning to everybody from all across North America. Funding Futures was a big, ambitious project tackling arguably the central issue that DMOs are facing right now, and our team at Miles Partnership, the teams at Civitas and Tourism Economics have all put in a huge amount of work. I want to give thanks to them, all of it largely donated pro bono. So the report and all the resources are going to be freely available for you to leverage and use. And I want to give a special shout out to Wendy Keel, formerly with Los Angeles, who also helped marvelously in this project. But there were so many wonderful helpers, and I want to thank the Destination Council of US Travel, and they really stepped up and helped make this happen. Our good friends at DMAC to make this a truly North American study. Of course, Aaron and the team at Destination Analysts, again, donated all their time pro bono. And Destinations International, a shout out to Jack and Andreas for all their input. And I want to acknowledge and thank the Canadians, and we're going to be running actually a special Canadian edition of this webinar with a particular north of the border perspective on September the 17th. So if you speak Canadian, join us then. And let's move right along to thanking all the DMOs who've contributed to this project, who participated in the discussion groups, responded to the surveys, provided comments and input. All the resources are going to be available by tomorrow. Everybody on this who registered for this webinar is going to get an email with a link to the full report, all the individual section reports, the recording, the slide set, etc. That's going to go out by 2 o'clock Eastern tomorrow, and you can see the web address right there where all those resources are going to be available and published. So let's strap in, and just a final note about European insights. So we've included a range of European examples, but we've actually been collaborating with our good friends at the Now Group in Copenhagen on a similar and parallel project with the ECM and ETOA, European Cities Marketing, and the European Tourism Association. So we're actually looking at running a joint North American European webinar to share comparisons and insights. So a lot of wonderful content. I'm going to pass over to John in a moment. Then we'll be looking at the research results from the DMO study. We'll be sharing with Adam the recovery scenarios. John and I will give you a taste of some of the recommendations and opportunities in terms of funding. John will facilitate the panel discussion, and then hopefully after all of that, we'll have a few minutes for Q&A. So, John, we didn't quite put the fun in funding, I think, but we've got a lot of content.
Well, thank you so much, Chris, and welcome to all our listeners. We are so excited today to be releasing this report. It started small, but it grew into a collaboration of some very talented partners. It really is a comprehensive look at DMO funding and details some ideas for all of you to help with your funding challenges and to make your funding better, or as we like to say, build back budgets better. 70% of you said in our survey that you were looking at developing new or improved sources of funding. Well, here's a resource for you for generating those ideas and giving you some in-depth analysis of each one of the funding streams. There are 10 components to this report, as you can see on the slide that's up on the screen now. First, 2 years ago, we worked with the Destinations Council of U.S. Travel to look at tax rates across the U.S. in 100 jurisdictions. We've updated all of those tax rates around the U.S. Second, we did state, provincial, and local focus groups asking DMO leaders about what they thought about budgets and their funding. We did a survey of DMO leaders and state travel officials. We did a state funding update, a Canadian funding update. You're going to be hearing from Adam Sachs at Tourism Economics. They did a fantastic job on an outlook for DMO funding. And we left you with 10 enhanced funding options to consider as you move forward. And we didn't want to end this report without having some very specific recommendations for all of you. So we've included 10 recommendations for action. Next slide, please. So we wanted to start today by talking about the situation analysis, and I'm going to talk about taxes. One of the beautiful things, because U.S. Travel did this study 2 years ago with Civitas, looking at rates, is we had a benchmark. We had a stake in the ground. We can now look at what's happening to rates over time. And we were surprised to learn that in only 2 short years, 25% or 25 out of the 100 destinations actually raised rates, anywhere from 0.15% to 2%. The average rate rose from 14.6 to 14.9. And I will add, amongst larger cities, that rate increase was even more dramatic. It went from 15.4 2 years prior to 15.9. We are just about 16% on average across the larger cities in the United States. And we also looked at, in the report, various breakdowns by geography and found that the Southwest as a region has the highest rates. Chris, back to you.
Yes, we also stepped back and looked at the overall funding situation with CVBs, and you can look at this data we collected since 2008. The initial drop after the GFC, of course, but then a 25% lift to about $2.2 billion in estimated total CVB. If we move on to the states, we've actually got data all the way back to 1990, and a shout out to US Travel for their wonderful information. You can see those two big corrections around 9/11 and the GFC, but actually a slightly faster growth over the last 12 years. I wanted to highlight all of these because if we then move on to the tax information, you can see that in fact taxes right there in the middle, local taxes, state taxes, they're actually been growing faster than DMO budgets. And in fact, if we look at that tax revenue, so almost double in fact, and if we look at the total collections of state tax receipts and local tax receipts, it totals almost $662 billion. And that's just in the last sort of 10 or so years since the GFC. And we compare that to the budgets that we've just been discussing. The CVB percentage of their revenue compared to the total local tourism taxes has dropped from about 9% to 7% because they're growing less quickly, and states down slightly, but just 2% of over $440 billion of state tourism taxes collected over that time. And there's huge variations across the country by state. So fascinating to look at this comparison, hugely lucrative area of public funding. And we need to get that back. So let's pass it over now to Erin. Erin's going to join us and share the highlights of the research. Over to you, Erin.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks. I'll bring in the tourism and destination marketing organization's perspective by sharing findings from a survey we conducted in support of this endeavor with some very brief highlights. This survey was sent to all U.S. state tourism offices, excuse me, the 100 U.S. DMOs that were part of that 2018 study that John just mentioned, and the 25 Canadian DMOs who participated in a 2019 DMAC-led tourism funding study. We collected data from 115 of these organizations, broken out as you see here. Next, please. A critical first step assessing the paths forward is inventorying what functions and responsibilities tourism marketing organizations are currently tasked with, and we found there are a lot. The organizations at the bookends of the tourism funding spectrum, those with the largest and the smallest budgets, report the highest average number of functions that fall under them. Next. In addition to tourism marketing, destination branding and supplying tourism research are all critical functions of many of these organizations. American organizations are likely to be charged with managing one or more visitor information centers and tourism industry education and training. Canadian DMOs are more likely to be responsible for destination management functions compared to US-based organizations. And those on the city and regional level commonly serve as their community sales team for conventions and meetings, as well as sports, entertainment, and other events. Plus, over 60% have programs of work to support a membership. In fact, those with the largest budgets are likely to own sales functions, and relative to those with smaller budgets, they are more likely to maintain responsibilities for air service development, sustainability initiatives, and membership support. Next, please. Here is where average annual budgets and staffing levels stood prior to the crisis. Next slide, please. And here are the top sources of that funding. State tourism offices are most likely to be currently funded through their government budget. Hotel transient tax, the next most common funding source, distantly followed by advertising revenue and partnerships. American DMOs surveyed are largely currently funded by hotel transient tax, followed by partnerships, membership fees, and advertising revenue. Canadian DMOs most commonly funded by partnerships, membership fees, government funding, and then accommodations tax. On the next slide, if we look at other sources of funding, we see that city and regional DMOs have more diversity in their funding sources, as do the largest budget organizations. Important for the conversation that's coming subsequently. Right now, just under 1/3 of US DMOs receive government funds. A similar proportion are funded by a tourism improvement district. And note that 27.6% of US DMOs surveyed are currently receiving funding through taxes levied on Airbnb type rentals. So let's now look at the impact of the COVID-19 crisis. Next slide, please. Starting with the budget, nearly 90% of US and Canadian DMOs reported that their current fiscal year budget has or will decrease by 45.1% on average for US DMOs and by 59.4% on average for Canadian. About half of these organizations expect their next fiscal year budget to decrease as well by an average of 35.7% in US DMOs and 41.4% in Canadian. And there's an anticipated impact to each of their top funding sources. So this is the staffing impact. While nearly 2/3 of state tourism offices reported having no impact to their staff due to the pandemic, almost 70% of US DMOs and 86% of Canadian DMOs have laid off employees. Next slide, please. Here on the left are the average number of crisis-induced layoffs across these organizations. On the right, this is the average number of layoffs if we look specifically at those organizations who did have a staffing impact. American city DMOs are the most dramatic in this. Next slide, please. And during the biggest crisis to hit the travel industry in modern history, what do these tourism marketing organizations see when they look ahead? Next, please. US and Canadian city and regional DMOs are likely to say they are indeed reviewing changes in their primary roles and responsibilities because of the impact of the crisis. US state tourism offices are not as commonly doing so. Of those that are reviewing their primary functions, shown here on the right of your screen, over 90% of these Canadian and over 70% of these US DMOs are examining having an increased role in destination management in the future. Over half of these DMOs are also looking at an increased role in economic development as they look out to the future. And finally, in understanding how these organizations view their role in the future in more detail, we asked agreement with a number of different visions for the post-pandemic period. Next slide, please. On seeking alignment with key partners, economic development and government, there's a high level of agreement, even stronger among Canadians than American DMOs. Next, on their organization having a central role in improving tourism, focusing more on sustainability and resident and local business engagement. Again, high level of agreement, but stronger among city and regional level DMOs than state tourism offices. Next, similarly, the city DMOs are likelier to agree this crisis will result in a new normal relative to their organization's responsibilities, funding, and staffing. Next, please. On the concept of being smaller, in addition to more focused and more efficient, 3/4 of city level DMOs agree Conversely, just a quarter of state tourism offices see this as their future. Next slide. American tourism organizations, particularly those with smaller budgets, are likely to say they will strive to return to the pre-crisis normal relative to their responsibilities, funding, and staffing. And on the next slide, finally, as it relates to seeking and developing new and more sustainable sources of funding, those organizations seeking new funding models are more likely to be city-level DMOs, whose organizations have a greater number of responsibilities, an existing more diverse set of funding resources, and who anticipate having an increased role in economic development in the future. Should you have any questions on these findings or others we don't have time to cover today, please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you. Back to you, Chris.
Yes, thanks so much, Erin. And the full report, and there's lots of information in it, will be shared via that email up on that Funding Futures website address. And Erin will be joining us, or the team at Destination Analyst, September 2nd for the latest State of the American Traveller. So look for that webinar. Thanks so much, Erin. And let's pass over to Adam for a look at the recovery scenario. So we challenged the wonderful team at Tourism Economics to look at 3 recovery scenarios and compare it to what DMOs are thinking, what we've seen in past crises. So Adam, what's your crystal ball saying?
Great. Well, thanks, Chris. It's an audacious thing to do right now, is to try to predict how this is going to unfold. But this is what we do. So we're giving it a whirl. You know, a lot of consistency in the way that we're thinking about it with the way that the survey has produced results. You know, it's not surprising given that where we were in the spring with travel losses in the range of 90% and now plateauing at around 50% off of where they were a year ago, that this ecosystem that DMOs live in is going to be more scarce. And so whether it's general fund or whether it's Fed tax, the reality is that the available funding is a function of what's going on in travel spending, which has been hit incredibly hard. And one thing to note is that this is not a one-size-fits-all pandemic. And in fact, depending on where you are in the country, you're experiencing this in some of the travel industry somewhat differently. States that are more rural, offer more of an outdoor experience, are performing better than those that are anchored by an urban center. And so you can see Mississippi, Alabama, South Dakota, Wyoming, Arkansas, Montana, you know, among the relative top performers. And if you look at particularly just the last month, here I'm looking at March through July, there are markets and even, you know, individual destinations that are actually beating last year's performance because they're well positioned as an outdoor, low density alternative with drive radius to markets. But those that are anchored by an urban center or are a fly destination are the ones that are suffering the most. From the economic front, we're going to see a significant uptick in economic activity once we get third quarter data. The second quarter showed that 33% drop in GDP that shocked the world. But the third quarter is going to come off of that, and that's the phase 1 of recovery. But expect the U.S. economy to plateau at that point in terms of the rate of recovery. It's going to be slower as we move through the fall, and some of the risks are indeed skewed to the downside as we look at the path of the economic recovery. If you think about it in terms of traveler segments, here is a way to, in a sense, schedule out when different segments of travelers are going to return in an appreciable amount. So right now we're in the early stages of the recovery with domestic leisure drive travel coming back and some domestic leisure fly. The next phase of recovery is really, it's unlikely to be seen until next year. And so that does pose risk to the fourth quarter as the seasonality shifts from leisure to business without the business coming back. In the first quarter of 2021, the hopeful return of small meetings, regional meetings, and perhaps regional international between the US and Canada as well, we begin to see then. And then it's not until really, it looks more likely the second half of next year when we'll see large groups return and long-haul international. So these are not the full realization of recovery, but the beginning markers for recovery in these different traveler segments. Our forecast that we produce each quarter with STR just released last week. This is comparing hotel room demand, what happened during the great financial crisis with what's happening right now. So that gray line is the great financial crisis. It took 2 years, 8 quarters, from the trough of that crisis in terms of room demand to get back to where we were. We expect it to take 3 years for room demand to get back. So we're looking at now the third quarter of 2023 before we get room demand across the country back to where it was. However, keep in mind next year, especially the second half of next year, presents the possibility of return to something approaching normal with room demand at 81% of 2019 levels next year. Now, room revenue, it's a longer run here. We're looking at 15 quarters, not until the beginning of 2024 when we expect room revenue to return. Rate is going to lag, right? If you want to think about, well, what is next year going to look like? Well, in its entirety, we expect room revenue in the U.S. to be at 68% of its 2019 levels. So after a 50% drop, certainly a nice recovery, but definitely a new world order that we're having to deal with for a couple of years. It's not until 2022 where we get to that point where you start to feel like you can breathe again with getting to 86% of room revenue levels. So what does this mean? Well, obviously the bed tax directly flows into the outlook for those DMOs funded out of that stream. For those funded out of general fund, we did a forecast on what's going on with state and local tax receipts, and this is what I'm showing you here. During the great financial crisis, state and local tax revenues fell 11%. We expect it to fall by about double that when all is said and done. Now, we've netted out in these percent changes the property tax component because property taxes don't generally go into DMO funding. It's those things that are actually more elastic relative to economic activity, be they sales tax of the overall general fund. So indeed, there's a hit there as well, although not as great as those depending on bed taxes. And so here's the final forecast. There's a lot of detail in the report that I'd direct you to, but if you were, and this is just a way to visualize this, if you were funded in 2019 at $10 million, this is what funding might look like for you if you follow the national average. If you're funded by bed tax, well, you're looking at a cut of about half, right? If you're following the national average, with a recovery really taking place over the next 3 years. If you're funded out of general fund, well, the cut is likely to be not as severe, that 20% drop. But what's interesting is that no matter which funding stream you're kind of hitched to, you still get back to where you were in 2024. And so I think it really comes to the conclusion that the need for, be it through advocacy to increase funding within existing channels or taking advantage of some of the opportunities for new funding channels is absolutely incumbent upon DMOs to function at the same levels they were before the crisis. And indeed, there's a virtuous cycle here. Right? This is a static view, but you can imagine a situation in a destination where if you're able to secure additional funding, well, then you're able to accelerate the recovery in your destination, and that becomes a virtuous cycle toward for the entire industry and then for funding back and again. So thank you very much. It's great to be here with y'all.
Thanks so much, and thanks to the whole team at Tourism Economics for their wonderful contribution to this important study. So we're going to dive into the funding options, John and I, and this is where the rubber really hits the road. 10 new enhanced funding options were first shared in a discussion document. We got feedback. We put them in 3 broad types: the response to this immediate crisis, building more resilient funding models for the future, and then looking at opportunities for regenerative funding options, how we can build a more sustainable tourism industry and organization. So we're going to pick up just a small selection. Huge amounts of additional information and examples are in the full study. And let's have a look first at the really, subject to what Adam said, the most important area, arguably right at the moment. We've got a hugely challenging 12 to sort of 18 to 24 months or so ahead. We need to be smart and persistent in seeking short to medium term emergency funding. So the Coronavirus Relief Fund, EDA grants, other federal and even some local and state support, plus fingers crossed, some positive news or movement in the last sort of day or two around the Paycheck Protection Plan. And there's some great examples for the US and Canada and many other Western countries which have provided a broader range of support to ensure DMOs are ready and resourced to help kickstart and propel the recovery. And that's the advocacy that we need to be absolutely at the center of. I think people are aware that a number of states, including Utah and most recently Tennessee, have announced pretty significant support for tourism and DMOs as part of the Coronavirus Relief Fund. In the case of Tennessee, they've announced $15 million out of, I think it's a $22 to $25 million total fund for tourism, $15 million to directly support DMOs in the state. So there are some wins on the board, but a critical area. I want to also highlight short-term rental revenue. So look at this as one of the 10. So this has been a fragmented and frankly, chaotic process in terms of assessments, permitting, enforcement. So this is a chance to step back and to introduce a far higher degree of professionalism and consistency in what is a growing and important part of the tourism industry. And in fact, they've bounced back more strongly than commercial accommodation in many places, particularly those sort of more outdoors orientated. Utah provides a great example of where a state tackled the issue of short-term rentals, vacation rentals on a statewide basis, and they've got a sort of consistent approach to all of those critical areas. So again, something to have a close look at. And then finally, in terms of the options I'm going to share before passing over to John, regenerative funding. So if tourism's, excuse me, going to build back better, we need to think about opportunities for funding to incentivize the sort of travel we want to encourage, to disincentivize travel when we don't want it, for example, at peak times. And we need to be investing in community and environmental enhancements demonstrably for visitors and for locals. And DMOs need to be involved in this process. We've got a number of European examples of where they're at the table, they're helping manage this, syncing up marketing and management. So with that, further ado, and we've got great examples in Amsterdam and then Iceland. Over to you, John.
Well, thank you so much, Chris. And I'm going to be talking about 3 additional concepts that we've included in this study, and then we'll launch right into the recommendations. The first is building reserves, right? You may say, well, that's pretty obvious, John. We got to build reserves. There's a lot of folks taking advantage of the opportunity that is out there today. Our elected officials want to help us. They know DMOs and hotels have been decimated by this crisis, and they're looking for ways to help us, particularly policy decisions that don't involve investing additional dollars. So we have seen really a wide variety on this issue amongst DMOs. We talk to folks almost daily about this issue. Some folks have no reserves at all and haven't been allowed to have reserves. Some have over a year's worth of their budget in reserve. We found that the rules around reserves vary greatly, even sometimes between individual funding types. It's not uncommon at all for general fund dollars to have rules that if you don't spend it, you have to turn it back at the end of the year. And if you're operating under rules like that, this is a great time to be thinking about and working on policy changes that will actually allow you to build those reserves. We can go to the next slide. I did want to give a shout out to my friend Kevin Kane, who's not only created the first TID in Tennessee, which basically doubled his budget, but did a fantastic job on reserves. So we threw in a picture of Memphis here and wanted to recognize some of the efforts he's been able to do. The other concept, one of the other 2 concepts I wanted to share with you is really the evolution of dedicated funding. And I know many of you sort of know the history. DMOs generally highly dependent on bed taxes historically, And really, that all started to change around 1990 when tourism improvement districts first came on the scene. If you can believe it, it's been 30 years since the first one was formed. And then we've seen this grown into other areas. 10 years ago, we really saw this go into the culinary side of things, and there have been many culinary districts that have been included. And we've also seen TIDs diversify their revenue sources. So while most still rely on lodging, many of them have included attractions, they've looked at restaurants, some even have car rental and retail in them. So there are ways to use that mechanism and have really a diversity of funding types if you choose to do it. Some of the new things that we're working on is the first wine marketing district. I think we'll have that in the next few months. And if you can believe it, the first cannabis improvement district. Maybe we should call that a cannabis benefit district, or CBD probably would be a better name for that. And the one other concept I wanted to share with you that we highlight in the study is that a lot of folks are taking advantage of the focus on recovery. And so there are efforts, and I will say successful efforts, of folks that have called their districts self-help tourism recovery districts or tourism recovery and improvement districts. And this approach seems to be working very well to say, we are about recovery. This district is not temporary. It will continue on. We are about recovery now, and it will roll into a regular improvement district after we are through recovery. But by putting it in that nomenclature, that helps us a great deal. We threw in a slide here of Napa. Napa was one of the early adopters of tourism improvement districts, and we're having winery districts. Plus, I love wine. Want to give a shout out to Lindsay Gallagher and give Napa a little recognition there. Let's move on to the next slide. Tax increment financing. Some of you are familiar with this. It's been used generally to fund urban projects. It was based on property taxes. Some places have said, hey, we can use this same mechanism that is about promising future growth of the revenue stream on the sales tax basis and use it for tourism promotion. We highlight this, we discuss it in the report so that you can learn about it if you're interested in it. It does have some distinct advantages. It has a very diverse set of payers because you're looking at everybody that pays sales tax. And second, there's a very strong linkage to tourism growth overall in the industry because it doesn't just pick one part of the industry, it's the industry as a whole. There are a couple of challenges with this mechanism that I would mention. 3 state travel offices are funded through this. And one of the challenges they've had is oftentimes is still tied back to discretionary grants of approval. And we know what happens when that happens. You don't get the total amount that the model would suggest in times of strife or in times of political change. And second, it's most likely that you're going to need state legislation to be able to implement something like this. This is fairly novel in most states, and so it probably will require a state legislative effort to put it together. Okay, let's shift gears now. And as I mentioned before, we really wanted to leave you with some action items, not just a report of choices, not just a report of ideas and stats, but what could you do? What are some takeaways? What are some ideas that we had for recommendations? Okay, first, ensure that you've exhausted every option to secure stimulus. And you may say, this is obvious and we've worked hard on it, and I know so many have. The reason we've included this in there is what we found in DMO after DMO is that many have tried to go after this kind of money and run into many roadblocks. It can be very bureaucratic, it can be very challenging, and our message is persist. Those that are persisting, those that are continuing to go after these funding sources and work hard, either on their EDA grants or on the coronavirus relief fund money. Chris just mentioned in Tennessee, great success on getting coronavirus relief fund money down to the bureaus. And I know there's other bureaus that are getting it and some haven't. But really, those that are staying in there and fighting, we think in the end are going to do much better on this stimulus money. Don't be deterred. Keep it up and see what you can do. Hopefully, as Chris said, we'll get some relief on PPP, and that will be another option for DMOs. Let's go to the next slide, please. Strengthen predictability and mitigate risk in your current revenue streams. So while this also too may seem self-evident, it's surprising to me, there are lots of folks that haven't done a real deep dive into their current funding streams. Some have implemented some new ideas with respect to their funding streams. A couple of new ideas we talk about in the report is a concept, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, rolling averages. That is, if you don't want to see the dramatic ups and lately the dramatic downs in revenue from the city, you could explore, and some bureaus have said, we'll get an allocation based on a 3-year rolling average. That means not as high in the highs and not as low in the lows, but it smooths that out and makes your funding somewhat more predictable. As part of the surveys and part of the work we've done, we've also learned that some DMOs have actually been successful at putting their funding in a more preferential spot, putting it ahead of others so that the DMO funding comes out before some of that bed tax money is committed to other resources. And finally, one more slide is explore additional funding streams, right? This goes without saying, you're already doing it. As I mentioned at the outset, 70% of you said you want to do this. We're finding it is a very good time to be asking for policy decisions that don't necessarily ask for additional general fund money. So what is that? That's tourism recovery districts, that's sales tax increment financing. It's the short-term rental revenue that Chris mentioned about. Several DMOs are looking at how can we bring that into the mix for our DMO funding, and of course, regenerative funding models. With that, Chris, I will turn it back to you.
Yeah, just a final couple of recommendations from me before we'll go to the panel discussion. All of this review, of course, really needs to start with a rethink about your organization. So many of you, of course, are doing this. Erin shared those numbers. So really thinking about your future role, responsibility, and structure as a DMO. And we've got a whole section on that, including, economic development, destination management, etc. So in terms of, your role and responsibility, do you want to be engaged in the sort of capacity building with communities and industry that Oregon has really helped lead the states in? More latterly, Colorado's done some remarkable work, or communities like Newport Beach, and this concept of community marketing and really building on the concept that Destinations International has been championing of community shared values and reaching out to sort of the unusual suspects to build partnerships and revenue models around. And then just finally, ensure that you're tapping into the latest research and data on the crisis. You want to be at the table, of course, with the best information. So you're helping shape the response and the role of the DMO in the response in terms of all of these critical metrics and assessments. And of course, you've got a great starting point with the research and data analysis and resources that all of the partners on this call today have provided. So access that free research, look at about doing custom research in your own destination. So we are going to go to a quick poll, and we're going to ask a quick question. So we've talked about a few of the 10 options. We've given you 5 there. So if you could pick 3 of them, what's the highest priority for you and your DMO? In no particular order, if you could just pick 3 of those 5 that are going to be priorities for you for action in the next sort of 12 to 24 months or so. We'll just give you another, say, 10, 20 seconds to respond. Then we'll look at the poll results. Just a note about questions and answers. So we've got a number coming in. Thank you so much. Hopefully we'll have 5 or so minutes at the end to answer at least some of them. So please use the Q&A tab on the webinar navigation to offer your comments, suggestions, or questions. Let's have a look at the results. Okay, so they picked up on that message, John, about the importance of stimulus and recovery funding. You can see the issue we were highlighting, the role, responsibility, and structure of DMOs. I think that's absolutely fundamental. That's going to future-proof your organization. And we can see third is this whole issue of looking at new opportunities and dedicated funding. So, but there's a lot of work to do, and it's a critical area. So without further ado, let's pass over now to John. I'm going to leave John to facilitate the panel with Kathy and Al for their perspective on what this all means and what should DMOs be focusing on. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you so much, Chris. I am really pleased and really honored to have two great guests with us this morning. I think Nan said at the outset they were two luminaries among destinations, and I think she picked exactly the right word. Let's launch into it. And Kathy, I'd like to start with you if we could. You have a lot of experience in dealing with state budgets and scarce dollars. What have you done to try to leverage less than ideal funding and gain additional resources for the Colorado State Travel Office?
Well, the Colorado Travel Office has had to be scrappy for a long time. So last year we've really tried to be masters of our own destiny over the years. Last year we generated nearly $3 million to supplement our $20 million budget, mainly through ad sales on our own channels, but also through other educational pursuits. We also, just this past year, introduced a much more robust industry co-op that delivers enormous value for our industry partners while allowing us to expand our media footprint with other people's dollars. And now we're looking in a direction that really wasn't even an option in the past, federal relief dollars. And so our state was not among those fortunate ones that received part of their state's allocation of CARES Act dollars. But we are pursuing a $2.4 million grant from the U.S. Economic Development Administration. We're keeping our fingers tightly crossed, and we have high hopes that we're going to come in for that funding.
Boy, wouldn't that be terrific if you could get some of that EDA money? I know it's a difficult application process and difficult even once you get the money, but boy, what a boost that would be. You said, what, 2.5 million or so, you think?
Yeah, about 2.5 million. And so that is actually going to be a supplement to our budget. I know a lot of states have been discouraged because they were hoping to use those kinds of funds to supplement their promotional budgets. That's really not the path that EDA is supporting, but we're focused on restoring jobs, retaining jobs, and driving recovery. And that seems to be a path that they're very much willing to endorse.
Excellent. Well, Al, let's get you in here. I know you're a veteran of many city budget battles, and you have city funding now that's based on performance in previous years revenue, and that requires at the end of that a true up. What are you pursuing now to try to avoid the highs and lows associated with those different years and paying back the city?
Yeah, I think it came up in your presentation. Thanks for inviting me. But we have to be creative, right? And try to think of ways to get our budgets more level set. And so we have a model that's 23 years old. It's a dinosaur. So we are appropriated money. We get money out of bed tax. That's 90% of my operating budget is bed tax money. But these ebbs and flows of crisis, it's just not sustainable. And we have to, in some years, true up, meaning give the city back money that they're appropriated to us. And in light of COVID, this year's budget, we gave up almost $1 million, and next year's budget, it could be close to 4 million if we don't change. And so we're taking a look presently at how we can change our funding model to something more in this rolling average model. We think that can help us to be a little bit more level to handle some of the ups and downs of the marketplace. And I think all of us as DMO leaders, we're going to have to look at new models that make more sense in our individual destinations, or we're going to have to make these really tough decisions that we're making now with COVID, laying folks off, not marketing our destination the way we need to. So I think the models, funding models, we really need to take a really close look at what we can adjust and how can we make it more current in the marketplace.
Sort of leaving no stone unturned when it comes to finding various sources of funding for the DMO.
Absolutely.
And Kathy, you mentioned private source revenue. I know a lot of folks are focused on that. And we talked a couple of days ago, you mentioned you had a sort of a unique idea regarding advertising. Can you share that with the group?
Yeah, well, we still have a few hurdles to clear, but we are seriously exploring the revenue potential of creating a platform for cannabis-related advertising sales. Even though we were the first state to legalize the federal and state restrictions on the cannabis industry, really give them very few options for advertising. So we believe that given the range of cannabis-related travel experiences in our state, that there's real opportunity for the cannabis industry, as well as revenue potential for the Colorado Tourism Office by making this possible. So we're, as I said, we're plugging away at this. It's not a done deal, but it certainly points to, you know, some real potential from an industry that's generating hundreds of millions of dollars worth of tax revenue for our state.
It really takes being a pioneer on new things like this, doesn't it? To be successful at getting that mix, to get those supplemental sources, it's really about sort of pioneering those new ideas and new avenues maybe that folks haven't thought of before. And Al, speaking of pioneers, you're one of the few people in the country that has the distinction of starting not one, but two dedicated revenue sources, TIDs, in two separate destinations. Can you tell our listeners what led you to do that?
Well, thanks, John. You know, my first CEO gig was down in Mobile, Alabama. And like most DMOs, we're asked to deliver for our communities. Our hoteliers want us to drive occupancy. They want us to create all this demand. They want us to move rate. Our political stakeholders want us to be doing great work as well. But if you don't have the resources, the question becomes, how can you create the demand that our hoteliers and stakeholders need? And so I thought and felt and still do that the TID, Tourism Improvement District, is one model that as DMO leadership we should look at, because it sort of level sets. Our hoteliers should have skin in the game. If they're asking me as a destination leader to feed their hotel, then they need to help us to do the work, and we can't do it without resources. And so that was something we started talking about in 2014 in Mobile. They needed it, and fortunately they just got that approved 7 years later, just a couple months ago, but good for them. And then when I came to Baltimore in 16, the same thing. We were so dependent on bed tax. We need to drive the business, and we didn't have any options. I mean, where do you go to get resources? And this was really the only place we could go at that time. Fortunately, we were able to get our hotel community convinced that if they wanted us to move the needle in occupancy and drive business, we needed more resources. And so it took us about 1.5 years. Obviously, we partnered with Civitas to help us with this process, went to the state legislator first, and then we went to our city council to get approval. But you know, the good news was this is pre-COVID numbers. We're estimating $7 million in additional funding from TID. And so the question was, how could we have done that without the TID? And the answer is, we didn't have a way to get there. And so fortunately for us, this was approved this past October of 2019. It seems like 100 years ago now, but we got it moving. And I really think dedicated funding is an option that DMOs around the country should take a serious look at it. Obviously, you know, it's mentioned advocacy is a big play that we all have to get our arms around. We need to understand the political plan in our communities, but it's worked for us, and we're glad that we were able to get it approved before this pandemic hit.
Fantastic. Well, I know we didn't have very much time today, but I sure appreciate both of you guys participating. And I know folks can reach out to you if they want more information about what you've done. Certainly check out the report for those ideas. And Chris, I'd like to turn it back over to you to answer any questions that folks have out there.
Yeah, thank you very much. And just a note, we've got 10 or so minutes remaining till the top of the hour, and we've got a few questions to kick it off, but please put in some more. Just to let everybody know, the recording from today, all the slides are going to be available and shared out in that email, plus will be up on the Funding Futures website. So why don't we kick it off with Al and Kathy, and then Adam and Erin, if you want to rejoin us as well. Nandy's raised something that we did cover in the discussion document and in the final report, which is consolidation of DMOs. It can be a very political, challenging topic. the number of DMOs in particular city or regional areas, or it might be, this whole issue of the integration of tourism and economic development. How do we how do DMOs, do you think, thoughtfully approach this whole issue of, building back better in terms of more efficient organizations, including this question of consolidation? So,
that's a great question, Chris. And I'm of the school that everything needs to be on the table right now because we're trying to rebuild our industry and our organizations. So I think consolidation is a formula that needs to be looked at. Obviously, it's going to take political will. And I think as DMO leaders, we need to understand and know where the strengths are in our communities. Who's the folks, whether county executives, our mayors, our state delegates, who are the folks we need to lean on in order to make that one happen? It's going to take strong political will. That's the whole advocacy piece that we're going to have to own it and master it moving forward. So I wouldn't take consolidation off the table. I think it has to be a strategic play. Timing is going to be extremely important. And then who do you talk to that can help you navigate this one? Because again, you don't ever want to come across as you're just trying to shut people down or close a business down because you feel you got the best idea in the room. So I think politically, if you can rally the troops in your city, your region, that can help you navigate that space. In my opinion, that's the best approach, because I think consolidation is something that all of us need to take a look at if we can navigate the stream.
Yeah. Kathy, what would you add? Do states have a role in this discussion?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, rather than consolidation, my thoughts go toward collaboration. And I think there could be some really interesting collaborations. It's very difficult for states to drop their borders, obviously, but especially there have been long-time collaborations for international travelers, but I think there could be collaborations for domestic travelers as well. Just looking at my Western neighbors, there is a niche of travelers that we all appeal to. There could be some very thoughtful marketing plans that could consolidate our messages to target a certain type of traveler to come to the West, to come to those states, without saying specifically come to Colorado. This is a very radical idea. I haven't talked to it about, we're doing this internally in Colorado, but I do think there's potential. We all have to be thinking about ways to make our dollars work harder. And we may have to be setting aside some of the traditional formulas for success to find new formulas. And I think that could be one.
Very good. Let's bring in Aaron and Adam. So Adam, first, we've got a question here from Sally about you had 3 scenarios you mentioned. In terms of the brighter outlook, what are the sort of key events that we'd be looking for if there's a more sort of speedy, optimistic recovery?
Right. So in the report we do lay out 3 scenarios for the U.S. economy that Oxford has run, and both the downside and the upside relate to the pandemic itself, and therefore the schedule of that. Of course, the downside there is that cases rise that require additional lockdowns in the fourth quarter. The upside is advances and breakthroughs on either the therapeutic side or a faster rollout of the vaccine than is expected in the baseline forecast. So those are, I think, the risks to the outlook that exist on the upside and the downside are both directly related to the pandemic itself.
Very good. And Aaron, let me just ask a 2-part question, starting with you, and then I'll bring in Kathy and Al. So Alan raised the issue of workers at DMOs who've been either laid off or furloughed. What did the research highlight there in terms of which DMOs have been impacted the most in terms of staff numbers?
Well, the U.S. city level DMOs were impacted severely in terms of the overall numbers. They had the highest averages of having layoffs. Also, the largest funded organizations, so those with a budget of 30 million or more, had the most significant percentage of laying off staff. And the details, the numbers are in the report for you.
Okay, and then Kathy and Al, what have you been hearing about how these workers are being looked after, and what are the plans for bringing back furloughed workers and supporting them during that period?
Well, in our case, having a small team was finally a benefit because we were able to keep our small team intact. I do know that across our state, small DMOs have, small and large DMOs have had to lay off team members. But I know destination leaders have taken pay cuts. You know, there's if the PPP comes through for you know, for DMOs, that's going to be a huge help. Our state is putting together a loan and grant program that will be available to DMOs. So we hope that there will be some more relief on the way, but these aren't easy decisions, and there's no guarantee until budgets recover that these staff sizes are going to be coming back.
Very good. Al?
Yeah, we had to end up laying off 10 full-time people, and one thing we did for them was to take care of their COBRA payment for 90 days. We thought that would be just a good way to help them. We still have 12 people on furlough, and our hope is if Congress can get their heads right and get us a PPP approved, then we can bring some, if not all, of those 12 folks back. But part of these folks that we had to let go, we had to close our visitor center down. So this has had tremendous impact, and it's people's lives at stake here. And so we're very concerned about it, and we want to do our part to help and assist, and even help some of the folks we laid off find jobs. So we've even taken that step as well.
So let's just go to a final question, and I'll start with you, John, on this. So Destinations International, Jim is asking about the you know, community shared values. We touched on it a few times, whether it's economic development, whether it's looking at partnerships with unusual suspects, universities, for example, even commercial property developers and landlords, those sort of partners who could provide potentially revenue streams. What would you see as the sort of starting point to starting to build that partnership for a DMO?
Thank you, Chris. And at first, I'd like to say, I'll tell you some of the thinking that Destinations International is doing right now is really powerful. And this idea of community shared values is one that I think will be with us for a long time. It's changing our thinking. It's saying, what are we doing with the community? What are we doing to identify those things that are important to the community and important to us? And I think there will be long-term benefits from that. I think we will see others come to the table first, participating with us, understanding the importance of what DMOs do and how it impacts their industries. And then I think second, to be there as funding partners. So we're seeing that already start to happen in a lot of destinations, but there's a lot of work to do. And I think as we all think through that concept, think through what can we do that is really impacting our community, impacting all those different members of the community, and really educating them and bringing them in as partners, I think before too long, we'll see them at the table as funding partners in addition to partnering with us on projects.
Thank you, John. We'll have to wrap it up there, but I would just on that issue highlight London, the UK and New Zealand for some really innovative ways in which they've explored integrating the tourism story with all these other economic sectors. So have a look at those. I want to thank all our wonderful presenters and analysts today. I want to thank all the DMOs who contributed. Shout out again, of course, to the Destination Council of US Travel, our good friends at DMAC in Canada. And thank you to Adam, Aaron, John, and your teams. We're going to be having follow-up webinars to dig into some of these details, to look at that European comparative information. But for today, we'll be sharing the link after this webinar. In fact, it'll go out by 2 o'clock tomorrow, and the report and all its sections, etc., will be available. We look forward to your feedback. We wish you the best. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.